Coming up, the re-election of Donald Trump as President of the USA marks a new era in American and global politics. After his multiple attempts to overturn the Democratic outcome of the 2020 election, his refusal to provide a peaceful and orderly transfer of power, and his role as instigator of a violent insurrection, Trump's victory in 2024 represents a rejection of liberal democracy by the American people. Donald Trump's authoritarian policy agenda represents an existential threat to the UK. Stay tuned. With control over both houses of Congress and a Supreme Court shaped in his own image, the authoritarian-minded Trump is not just president, but de facto king of the USA. He's made it clear he intends to reshape every area of the state through partisan appointments to hitherto neutral functions of government. And he'll have a loyal army of MAGA cult members ready to carry out his every wish. For any UK government, and particularly the current Starmer-led Labour government, this will create huge dilemmas. The UK has structured its whole post-war defence strategy around the USA and NATO. And the US is overwhelmingly the most important security relationship that the UK has. But even before he takes office, Trump's team is seeking to veto the British deal, handing back the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, already causing conflict with the UK government and providing a foretaste of what's to come once Trump accedes to the presidency. And this week, Trump appointed a Fox News presenter with zero experience in government as his defense secretary, and also, by the way, an alleged sex trafficker who engaged in sex with minors as his attorney general. Just two of many completely wacko appointments Trump has already announced. Until 2016, all post-war UK governments have based their defence policy on the assumption that the US would remain the great bastion of liberal democracy and a cooperative partner of every nation in the free world. But after Trump's ascent to being the so-called leader of the free world, that assumption seems a little off. And with his return in 2025, it's all too clear that the USA voters are no longer committed to the ideal of liberal democracy, voting in a man who has clearly said that he will be a dictator on day one.
We love this guy. He says, "You're not going to be a dictator, are you?" I said, no, other than day one.
Trump also said this.
And again, Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You got to get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not going to have to vote.
As Maya Angelou once warned us, when people show you who they are, believe them. Trump is ending voting. He's ending democracy in the USA. And for those voters who are in favour of democracy, who take solace in the thought that, we can get through 4 years of this, stop kidding yourself. Trump had to be dragged out of the White House by his ankles last time, after his failed violent insurrection. Do you think it's going to be any easier this time? And those of you who think, he can only serve 2 terms, that'll be the end of it in 2028. Well, I'm sorry, but I would question that assumption too. Trump has already joked about doing a 3rd term, and I can well imagine him doing whatever it takes to rescind the 2-term limit, with the malleable Supreme Court bending to his will. A scary thought for America, but also for the rest of the free world. And as the UK's USA-based defence strategy falls apart, it's at a time when the other gift from 2016, Brexit, has dissolved our previous economic and trade strategy, which until Brexit was based around our membership of the European Union. The military alliance with the US was cemented in the creation of NATO and became the foundation of British security. And the UK's economic destiny for decades had revolved around the bastion of the EU. There is no substitute for our US security alliance, and Brexit has proved that there is no substitute for the EU as a trading partner. The EU, even after Brexit, remains the UK's natural partner through its size and proximity, both economically and culturally. Even last year, the EU provided 55% of all the post-Brexit UK's imports of goods and bought 47% of its exports of goods. The UK is a highly trade-dependent economy. While the larger EU members are even more trade-dependent, their most important partner is the rest of the EU. The UK is now an outsider in every sense. And the situation is threatening to get an awful lot worse with Trump in charge. He's set not just on weakening the USA's commitment to NATO, but also even more committed to raising barriers to trade. There is talk of at least a 10 to 20% tariff on trade with the UK and other countries. Analysis by the IMF suggests that these tariff levels will have significant negative effects on both the US and the world economies. And for a post-Brexit Britain open to trade but outside of the EU, this will be devastating. So what should the UK do given all these threats and the fragile state of the British economy after 14 years of Tory misrule? There's sod all it can do to stop a global trade war initiated by Trump's America, but it seems to me there are two options for Keir Starmer's government. First, it could kiss the ring and try to persuade Trump's administration that, as a close ally and a country with a trade deficit with the USA, it should be exempt from the new tariffs. Trump could use an exemption to insist that the UK implements a further rise in defence spending. With the current conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East and increased Chinese military aggression in the Indo-Pacific region, that's maybe not a bad idea for Britain anyway. Trump would love the grovelling from Keir Starmer and David Lammy for sure. But who knows if such a plea for tariff exemption would actually work. The alternative and opposite option for Starmer's government would be to decide that the US is a lost cause under Trump and seek instead to mend all bridges with the EU and partner up to resist the economic onslaught. To anyone not in the Brexit cult, it's obvious that Brexit itself should be completely revisited, not least because the misinformation on which British voters base their vote has now become undeniably obvious. And also, the world has changed markedly since the fateful advisory referendum, and 8 years later, it now looks increasingly irrelevant as it shrinks in the rearview mirror of history, and UK voters now say they think it was the wrong decision by a ratio of almost 2 to 1. But even if Starmer were to belatedly acknowledge that to make Brexit work is a laughable idea, the bigger problem is that the EU is nowhere near ready to reopen the Brexit can of worms. And to be honest, I'm not sure that the British electorate would stand for any Brexit referendum to be rerun just yet, with all the toxic debate and fractures that would lead to. But that doesn't stop the Labour government improving relations with the EU wherever possible by minimising the impact of Brexit, adhering to all EU standards, honouring all Britain's pledges made as part of the Brexit agreement, signing up to proposals like the one on the free movement of young people, continuing the positive mood music initiated by Rishi Sunak and further developed by Starmer. There are huge economic and defence dangers heading towards the UK, and the closest possible alliance with the EU will be perhaps the best way to defend against Trump's attacks on open markets, multilateralism and international cooperation. There's a resurgent extreme right in Europe itself that opposes liberal democracy, but nevertheless, as a whole, the EU has now taken over from Trump's America as the strongest bastion of liberal democracy by default. The UK can't oppose the US on its own. If it dares to take on Trump in some vital areas, it has got somehow to find powerful allies in Europe and around the world. Brexit has made all that even more difficult. Perhaps Trump's America is not an enemy or a hostile state quite yet, but it's becoming clear that Britain's economic and security interests, along with its social and political values, will no longer align with those of its historic ally for as long as Trump is in charge.